Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma for our monthly webinar series. My name is Corey Davidson, and I'll be your host today. For those of you joining us for the first time, NCORE offers 2 webinars per month on the first and last Wednesday. Our Emerging Scholars webinar are held on the first Wednesday, and they focus on ideas that speak directly to the experiences of students. These webinars are either facilitated or co-facilitated by a student and are intended to identify emerging scholars. These are always available at no cost. Please visit our website at www.ncore.ou.edu for the full list of webinars on demand. You're welcome to use the chat box to tell us where you're joining us from. Also tweet, Instagram, and share with the hashtag NCORE webinars and hashtag start the conversation online. Our presenter today is Dr. Shaquila Melchor. Dr. Melchor is a nationally board certified counselor and a licensed professional school counselor in Virginia. She is currently an assistant professor of counseling and development at George Mason University, as well as a clinician at the Wise family. Dr. Melchor has recently begun an administrative appointment as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the College of Education and Human Development. She received her PhD from Virginia Tech in 2017 and holds a master's degree in school counseling from North Carolina A&T. Today's topic is fostering connections, a relational approach to advocacy. The center is grateful for your expertise. Please post questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Please welcome Dr. Shaquila Melchor.
Thank you for that warm introduction. And I love the NCORE video. I always appreciate a dope beat. So I was over here jamming a little bit while I was learning. So I'm getting ready to share my screen. If you all could, because it makes me feel good, just share in the chat where you're from, your background in terms of the work that you do. I'd love to know who is in the room. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a lot of information to share, so I might go through some of it quickly, but I think when we have time for questions, that should be helpful for me to clear up anything that wasn't discussed. All right, let's rock and roll. Alrighty, so of course, my presentation is titled Fostering Connection, a Relational Approach to Advocacy. So this particular topic was birthed out of my dissertation research. When I was a high school counselor, I spent a number of years working with minoritized students, and specifically I'd worked with undocumented students. And it was in that role that I began to realize how much I didn't know. And it was painful for me to not be able to help my students. There was a big disconnect there to see them, but not be able to help them. And the relationship that I formed with those students allowed me the opportunity to advocate for them on a meaningful behalf, but also to provide them the opportunity to advocate for themselves. So I spent a lot of time gaining knowledge, spending time with them and learning more about their experiences. And then we decided to take what we call now roadshow in their junior and senior year of high school, where they went around the state of Virginia and discussed immigration reform. And these were all 16, 17-year-old students. And that was a very powerful experience for me of what it meant to build a relationship, especially with young people, that empowers them in a meaningful way. So I'm going to kind of share some objectives, but before I do that, I want to take a moment and allow you all to read the land acknowledgement statement. And this is the land that we inhabit here at George Mason University. So I'll give a minute for that. So just to briefly share the objectives so you all have an idea of where we're going. I'm going to give some definitions because I don't want to make an assumption of the knowledge that we do or don't have as it relates to immigrant populations, give a little bit of fast facts, some context as it relates to educational attainment. I'll spend a little bit of time on policy, then I'll go into challenges and barriers, and then spend the bulk of our time on relational cultural theory and how that leads into relational advocacy. And I will happily answer any questions that's not expanded on in the presentation. So oftentimes when we're talking about immigration, we have a tendency to lump as a whole, right? So we want to be able to differentiate what we mean when we say immigrant populations. So someone who is an immigrant, they have the intention to stay in the United States. So that's someone who's a lawful permanent resident, which could be a green card holder. So the idea of green card has kind of a negative connotation. So green as an alien is why people say green card holder. From a legal standpoint, it is lawful permanent resident. Now, someone who's a lawful permanent resident can naturalize over time. That takes on average about 10 years. And they be naturalized as a citizen of the United States. There's refugee asylees, and that particular group is coming here due to some type of unrest or harm that is happening in their home country. One says that you have to apply ahead of time, and the others is I step onto the land and I'm seeking asylum. So I'm asking for help the minute I step onto the land. Someone who is listed under USCIS, which is the United States Citizenship Immigration Services, a non-immigrant has the intention to leave the United States. So it's temporary. So individuals who have a student visa, temporary workers, so you think of migrant workers who come, individuals with a visitor visa, they actually would be temporary here in the United States. So when we take those particular ones, and then we think of undocumented immigrants, those are individuals who either came here or were brought here through the US without legal documentation, or they could have overstayed their visas. So here's a catch-22. If I have a 10-year visitor visa, technically in the United States, you're supposed to only stay 6 months and then leave. If for some reason you stay longer than that, you actually go into what's considered a status that's no longer acceptable in this country, which kind of puts people under an undocumented status. So sometimes we have a tendency to make assumptions about who undocumented immigrants are, and it's often incorrect. Underneath the undocumented immigrant status can be temporary statuses. So someone who is a DACA holder, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, is an undocumented immigrant who's granted temporary stay in the United States. So they can have a work permit, a driver's license, social security card. Depending on the state that you live in, you can receive state financial aid. You can never receive federal financial aid. And then there's individuals who have TPS, which is temporary protected status. And those are specifically designated countries that are allowing their population to enter into the United States due to some type of environmental injustice. So think of hurricanes that happened in Haiti, and you see how they started to push those people back to Haiti, ongoing conflict, or it could be an extraordinary circumstance that would have them here. TPS is not something that we spend a lot of time talking about, but it is something that comes up more often than we realize. There's just not a large population that have temporary protected status. So just a few fast facts. There's 44.9 million immigrants in the United States, which represent 13.7% of the population. 21.3 million are refugees, with 3.2 million being asylees. And about 11 million immigrants are undocumented. And close to 600,000 of them are DACA recipients, and only 320,000 are TPS recipients. When we start getting onto our side, so higher education, there's about 454,000 undocumented immigrants enrolled in higher education institutions, and 10% of that are enrolled in graduate school, so about 45,000 students. So I wanted to offer that context as well. So I always believe in giving good information when we're talking about advocacy for immigrants, especially undocumented immigrant populations. People have a lot of stereotypes when they're discussing this particular group, and they have a tendency to talk about their education or the assumption that there's a lack of education. So I was very intentional to include educational attainment. And if you look here at recently arrived immigrants, close to 50% have a bachelor's degree or higher. Oftentimes what happens in our country is we do not deem those degrees acceptable. And so the individual is unable to use them, which creates barriers over time, right? So if I cannot use that, then I'm limited on access to certain jobs or career fields that I was working in my home country, I'm no longer able to do here. So I wanted to provide that as well. And then I'm not going to go through this chart. I love this chart. I will be sure to make sure if you want the PowerPoint, you can reach out to the NCORE staff, but I like to give policy that has happened over at least the past 5 years. If you do immigration research, one of the things that's a little difficult to stay with is how much it changes. So there are a couple of things that are happening right now with immigration that we're just trying to see what happens. There's Build Back Better, which may defer deportation for 10 years, which doesn't create a pathway to citizenship. But there's also the American Dream and Promise Act, which passed the House back in February. So that's seeming to stall in the Senate. That would actually create a pathway to citizenship specifically for undocumented immigrants. So I'm just going to share those couple. And then before we get into, I would say, one of my favorite pieces, I want to share just briefly challenges and barriers that are experienced. So I'm going to talk about them from three particular areas: the political, institutional, educational barriers, and then mental health barriers. So we know when we're thinking about immigration that we do operate in a broken immigration system. There's not adequate pathways. We spend a lot of time discussing who should be allowed to come in here, who shouldn't. Depending on the country that you come from, it could take you 10 to 20 years. Some countries have agreements with the United States that makes immigrating here a lot easier. And so that broken immigration system creates a barrier for individuals from certain countries, particularly individuals from Black and Brown countries, to be specific. We have spent the past couple years just kind of seeing the impact of anti-immigrant sentiments and the impact that has had on individuals. And then we know that the legislation at the state and also the federal level is very limited as well. There are educational barriers that exist specifically for undocumented immigrants. So think about barriers related to academic achievement and preparedness. So a good comparison to that will be your first generation college students, that lack of college cultural awareness, not knowing what you don't know. So the assumption that they should know how to navigate the process of going into college should be examined a bit differently. But also, how does that person be able to be retained once they are enrolled in college? Even at the graduate level, there's no one who has gone and got a master's or a PhD prior to them. What does that look like for them when they're trying to obtain those particular degrees? And then an added layer on top of that is, let's say I obtain all these degrees. I'm a DACA recipient. They put a stay on DACA again. I can't actually utilize my degree because I fall underneath that undocumented status. So even reconciling that with someone is part of the conversation as well. We know that there are significant financial aid barriers. Individuals who are undocumented are not eligible for federal financial aid. Some states do allow for aid at that level. We would look at California as kind of a model of providing aid to undocumented students. And we know that there's a restricted access to higher education for undocumented immigrants. And then lastly, because I'm a counselor, so it's important for me to mention the impact of mental health. So if someone is trying to acculturate to this particular country, there's a lot of stress that comes from that. What does it mean to be in the United States? How do I acculturate to this where I can still maybe hold on to my culture, but be able to navigate the new spaces that I'm in? There's some research on pre and post migration trauma. So the trauma that individuals experience prior to immigrating, which could be the impetus for their immigration, and the trauma that they experience during migration. So if you go read about coyotes and smugglers, there's trauma that is experienced during the migration experience, and then trauma that is experienced once that person has arrived. So resources are not always available. They could be living in substandard living conditions. There may be restriction to access. So think about healthcare. The Affordable Care Act is not available for undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants almost always pay taxes. They're taxed on not having health care. And so even their access to being able to get help is limited. So we see an increase in mental illness. If you look up United We Dream, they just did a really nice study on the impact of COVID-19 and these changes on undocumented immigrants. And unfortunately, they have seen an uptick in depression, feelings of PTSD that have come out of it. So I wanted to mention those particular ones as well. All right, so to my bread and butter, which is relational cultural theory. Just for context, this is a counseling theory, and I am adapting it to a broader framework. And I say that because obviously, if you are not a clinician in the space, you may say, hey, some of this is a little difficult for me to use or understand. What we're going to try to do today is take that up a notch to this framework piece, as opposed to approaching it from a therapeutic context. Some of the language will be therapeutic in nature, but I'll kind of break that down in a meaningful way that can be applied to many groups. So relational cultural theory is the only counseling theory that was not normed on white men. Counseling in its frame is a Eurocentric view, and then they added on multicultural and diverse groups to the field later. So this particular theory takes a feminist and multicultural perspective that promotes social change. And those of us who ascribe to this theory have a strong emphasis on the importance of relationships and connectedness. And so for those that are therapists, what we believe is we want to lessen the suffering that the individual experienced through disconnection and isolation. And I'll spend some time on disconnection. And then we want to increase our client or students' capacity for relational resilience, their ability to come back from those sorts of disconnection. So within that, we promote self-reflection. There's a recognition of culture and systemic barriers that impact the ways in which the person in front of us is navigating the world and how it can navigate the relationship that we have with them. We value respect, trustworthiness, and authenticity in the relationship. And we want to focus on the change in an attitude and understanding of the person rather than utilizing techniques. So one really great quote that comes out of relational cultural theory is to place culture alongside connection at the center of the theory is to break a critical silence. So you are a whole person with multiple identities, and we know that who you are impacts the connection that you have with others. And in this case, we're talking about undocumented students specifically. So there's 3 tenets that come out of relational cultural theory. And yes, these are kind of long, but remember, you can have the PowerPoint and that's kind of nice, but I'm not going to read this to you. So in the 3 tenets, there's mutual empathy, mutual empowerment, and growth fostering relationships. In mutual empathy, what we're showing is me, the person in the relationship that has the power, that could be the counselor or that could be the higher ed professional, is showing how they are impacted by the experiences of the person speaking to them. And that could help move the student into a position of connection. And then that pulls them out of this kind of isolated feeling that they're not being heard, or the feeling of hopelessness that nobody is acknowledging what they are going through. And then that allows a level of comfort to come into this space. If I can show you empathy, you can in turn have empathy for yourself, which strengthens your overall sense of self and awareness. Then we have mutual empowerment. And this is a direct result of mutual empathy in growth fostering relationships. And this is formed throughout the relationship. So if we think about it from a social justice perspective, when the individual that we're working with is empowered, it increases the potential for advocacy, our advocacy, and also theirs. If I'm empowered and I am moved by the experience of that person, it can inform the way in which I advocate moving forward. We may want to be advocates, but you cannot be a strong advocate if you've not been in somebody's space. You are invited there. And if you're invited there, then you honor that space as a listening participant. And so that empowerment is shown, and we give that to the person in the space with us. And then lastly, we want to foster the relationship, and that helps with the person's awareness, their feelings and experiences as it relates to the relationship. And we'll actually spend more time on this particular piece as well, but I wanted to give context for those 3. And don't worry, I'm gonna bring it all back home together, but I think it's helpful to give the context of the theory. So I want to pause and talk a little bit about disconnection, because relational cultural theory does a really good job of talking about disconnection in the context of oppression when it comes to individuals who are minoritized. So disconnection happens when a person does not feel heard or understood, and they're usually disappointed. They may feel a sense of danger or violation. They may feel like they can't go any further. And with the relational cultural theory, we see this at 3 different levels: acute, chronic, or traumatic. Now, traumatic disconnection, that person will not return to connection, and we don't encourage that, right? Because it's traumatic. It's led to some type of post-traumatic stress for that individual, and so it's no longer healthy. Chronic disconnection is continuous, and the person without the power cannot express themselves or opinion in the relationship. So let's liken that to something. Think of microaggressions. Microinvalidation could be acute disconnection. It occurs frequently. The person who is engaging in the micro-invalidation has a failure to understand it, hinders the relationship. That chronic part is when we get into those bigger microaggressions where it continues to happen over and over again. It's creating this disconnection. And then think about implicit bias. That disconnection keeps happening, and the person without power is not able to express that part of themselves. Where this shows up a lot with undocumented immigrants is conversations like, oh, well, you're undocumented, you can't go to college. Oh, you're undocumented, I'm not sure how you'd be able to pay for that. You probably should just go straight to work. I'm not sure what you could do. There's an article I read where they was like, how'd you get over here? Swim across the sea? That's a chronic disconnection. Because now what you're doing is you're not validating the person's experience and you're creating harm in that. And that's kind of that disconnection. So when we're doing our own work, if we're taking a relational approach, we have to reflect on the ways in which we have been complicit in disconnection. How have we fostered disconnection in relationships with diverse populations? And if you have worked with undocumented students, how have you participated in disconnection in that relationship? So with disconnection, the way RCT frames it is with this relational and controlling images. So the student that comes into the space have these relational images. So this is based on their past experiences, and they often happen early in life, and they come in with preconceived ideas. So if you think about it this way, if I feel disconnected from a counselor, for instance, and they come into the space with a new counselor, they have a relational image at that point. They have an idea of who that person would be like because they have an image from a previous experience. So there is value in what we call repairing narratives in relational cultural theory. There's controlling images, which comes on our side of it, the counselor or the higher ed professional. And they enter into the relationship with these preconceived thoughts, which are often stereotypes that could shame or disempower the person they're in relationship with. And this is directly related to this idea of power over ideals that are situated in the relationship that create these controlling images for the counselor that turns around and pushes up against connection and moves more into disconnection. So power over ideals is the concept of when the dominant group exercises power over a non-dominant group. And they do that in a way to maintain power. And we know the dominant group defines what's inferior. So think of socialization, which was presented by Bobby Harrell. Socialization says that we have been conditioned to believe what is best, who deserves power, who does not deserve power and access. And part of how we have done that is through social constructs. So when we're thinking about power over, we're saying that these particular groups, US citizens, should have more power or more say over an immigrant who comes into the country, despite the amount of contributions that they make. So then what do? We're like, oh crap, like there's disconnection all over the place. How do we foster more connection, right? How do we bring that relationship back? And that through connection in relational cultural theory is through a number of ways. So I always say this to my students when I'm teaching class, like, I am showing you respect because this is your space, this is your education. And so I want to be able to be respectful because that fosters the connection. Showing vulnerability in that space. So that's a way of self-disclosing, or there are moments where I've teared up with clients or teared up with students for them to be able to see that I can be vulnerable in that space, having an empathic encounter. So the way that we say this in counseling is something as simple as, if you watch Brene Brown, she does this a lot, is, whew, wow, just that settling, just, whew, that's a lot. I appreciate you sharing that. Just that kind of emoting with that person and being able to engage authentically with them is a part of all of this idea of empathic encountering and showing vulnerability and showing respect. Through connection, Jean Baker Miller, who was one of the founders of relational cultural theory, says that 5 good things can happen when we foster connection. The person that we are working with can have an increased feeling of zest or vitality, so energy. It can increase their sense of worth. They're more willing to act and engage in the world. They can have a greater awareness of themselves. And they even increase their connection to others and are more motivated to connect. So when we're thinking about connection, if we're trying to sort of measure it in the relationship, we can see this shift happening in the person where they're taking more ownership of their lives, they're feeling more empowered, and they're getting to a place where they're like, okay, I want to make moves myself. And I may do that alongside you, or I may do that on my own. So if we kind of summarize relational cultural theory before we go into relational advocacy and what does that look like in terms of relationship in higher ed or in counseling, I want to give a brief summary just because I know I talked through that pretty quickly. There's a focus on change in attitude and understanding. We recognize that change is a shared journey. So we want to move from power over to power with. And in our relationship with an individual, we want to have corrective relational experiences, repairing that narrative, repairing that disconnection, decreasing their feelings of isolation, and reworking the relational failures. When we rework relational failures, what we're saying is, I recognize that you have had relationships in the past that were not especially helpful to you in your growth. My goal here is to rework that and create a relationship that is mutually empowered, that gives you the power in this space as well. So some of the literature, when we think about working with undocumented students specifically, and they've been interviewed, they say that relationship that they have is so impactful in their success at the higher education and K-12 level. So when we're reworking those relational failures, we're creating access for them through the relationship. So the way that we make those connections is through being institutional agents, empowerment agents, and looking at mattering and power with. So when we start to frame what the relationship looks like for us, an institutional agent is someone who has power, someone of a high status. It could be in society or in the institution. And that particular person connects the students to information and support. So while we're creating this beautiful relationship, we're utilizing the power that we have to create access, to provide information, and to provide support. With that, we can also create this notion of empowerment agents. And this person also has high status in a relatively high position that usually can be a gatekeeper with social capital, so creating more access. So there's a quote about empowerment agents that I think sums this up really well. Manifesting one's capacity as an empowerment agent is not only about enabling the authentic empowerment of the student or young person, but is also about participating with them in changing their world in some significant ways. So when we get to relational advocacy, the framework, we're centering a lot of that on the empowerment agent. When I am able to give you power in this space, you in turn feel empowered to be able to make moves yourself or in connection with another person. When we talk about mattering and power with, we want to be able to shift the perceptions that were created by the controlling images. So we talked about this a little bit. So the way we would do that is allow the person to express the pain or disconnection to the more powerful person. And then you respond with interest and concern. You acknowledge that pain. You acknowledge that disconnection. That allows us to move into this position of power with, where it's collaborative in nature, the relationship. And it grows as it empowers others, and it stands in opposition of power over ideals. The idea is that the student needs long-term relationships that can resemble kinship, but also short-lived instrumental relationships. So the relationship that you have with someone, especially when you think about collectivist groups, we do not operate in this individualistic frame. And so being able to have relationship and connection becomes really powerful and meaningful. We're able to collaborate in that space. So that leads me to relational advocacy, which kind of ties in all of this together now that we've given this context. And then I'll end with just kind of some next steps or things that you can do that could be especially helpful for you. So the concept of relational advocacy was birthed out of the ACA advocacy framework. ACA is the American Counseling Association. And so in our field, we developed an advocacy framework that was something counselors could use in terms of advocating with and on behalf of the client or students that they serve. So we take this and we expand it, and we expand it to relational advocacy. And all I did was tack on these three pieces, and I'll kind of say why, but let me flip back just so we like, oh, surprise. So if you look at the bottom, there's micro level to macro level. Micro level, of course, is at that individual advocacy, but that macro level is when we start getting to the public arena. So that's when you get into legislation, working with congresspersons, doing direct action work, whether that's marching or informing others. So that would kind of be that public arena. The idea of relational advocacy is that it's no longer this separate piece. So the counselor or the higher ed professional is not engaging in this as kind of like a savior. They're saying, okay, I want to be able to have this point of connection with you in this relationship. And I am trying to make a change and impact in a way that is meaningful based off of what you are sharing with me. So I'm not making assumptions about what is needed. I am going to the source. I'm sitting and learning and engaging in that space. And so when that person is with you in a relationship, the more empowered that they feel, the more that they are able to receive empathy or show empathy, the more comfortable they are with sharing, and the more they are able to move into connection. When they move into connection, that empowerment goes up and down. There's no longer this kind of power hierarchical approach. There's this idea of, hey, I am here. I may have power in the room. Would you like me to step forward, or would you like for me to step back? Also, reading the room, identifying when you just need to step forward. The more that we are able to sense that empathy, and that's the counselor in me that talks about the nervous system, you should be able to, you can feel what's happening in the room. When we sense that, we can also identify moments where we may need to step forward, but also moments where we need to step back from a place of empowerment, right? So we're assigning that power to that person in a way that maybe in that space they don't have, right? So if we move that, we want to transition to that school/community level. So creating access to education, collaborating with stakeholders that provide resources, and then identifying other allies that can move individuals forward into this sort of systemic or structural change, right? So when we start looking at these systemic issues, what we often hear people say is, I was not heard. When we do research, are you entering into the space of the person that you are trying to advocate for? And did you co-opt their space? Were you invited in their space? That's part of relationship. Before you can do strong advocacy work, you should build relationship. There should always be an invitation. Anything aside from that is oppressive in nature, because that is a takeover, because you weren't invited into the space. So when we're thinking about relational advocacy, that's kind of the point that we're moving into, right? That's meaningful for the people that we're working with. So I realize I talk fast, so I will be done early, but that's okay. I can always answer questions. I like to always provide a very tangible resource that individuals can use when we're thinking about building the relationship, creating the safe spaces, and then what does advocacy look like? So something that we do in counseling is called broaching. And broaching is the idea that the person who has the power in the room, so in the context of my field would be the counselor, brings up the topic of culture and identity first. So a way that you might do that is, I am really glad to be with you today. I would love to learn more about you. The way that I do that is learning more about your identities. I do utilize the respectful model, which looks at your religion or looks at your sexual orientation or your gender. You're welcome to share as much as you like or as little as you like, and I will start that conversation. And then through broaching, I actually share some of my identities of whom I am. Then you want to be able to disseminate information in individuals' native language, and recognizing that that should be ever changing and ever evolving. So continue to checking on the information that should be disseminated. If you're working with people individually, so you have a smaller group, are there changes in the clients or students that you are serving? During the Trump administration, specifically in 2016, we would start to see a lot of noticeable changes in individuals' behaviors. Their affect was low. There was a lot of concern and fear. When we're able to identify that, then we can be able to assist in putting resources in place. You also want to be knowledgeable of the changing policies, specifically in your state. There are times where policies come in that can be helpful and create more access for individuals. And so you want to be knowledgeable of that as well. And some ways that we do that is through professional development. You can also create a safe space. So if you've heard of UndocuAlly, you can go through that training, and that allows you to put it's like an image that you put outside your office that shows that you're a safe space, that you have went through a training to be able to work with that group. You also want to create safe space within the community itself. So if we're in a higher ed space, we oftentimes are regulated to our ivory tower. How do we go out and build community? So one thing that I did as a high school counselor that I think was helpful was I did a college fair, but I did it outside at a local park and had individuals come who could translate as opposed to doing it inside the school building. Did it on a Saturday where more parents had access. So going in and accessing the community looks a lot different. Of course, we know to embrace different cultural backgrounds, but being able to develop support groups in different spaces is really important as well. So we know that representation matters. Having support of peers who have similar backgrounds to you is very valuable. So at your institution, what are the support groups? And if you are maybe in admissions, for instance, are those support groups articulated to different programs? So do the programs know about these support groups or these affinity groups that students can use? And then develop inclusive programming that could be helpful as well. Something as simple for undocumented students specifically is doing a workshop on access to funding for their education, scholarships that are out there, grants that are out there, fellowships. And then a point of advocacy on that side is oftentimes fellowships, scholarships that are at the state level require social security number, and they don't always have to. So that can be a reasonable question to ask when you're trying to do workshops or look at funding. Do you need someone's social to be able to afford them this? Can they provide you some sort of documentation to in the application just saying that they are an undocumented, or even moving beyond that, do they even have to tell you that, period? Can they just say they are a student enrolled in the university looking for funding? One way that we see a lot of funding come out is specifically in community colleges. They have a significant amount of endowment funds that usually are not earmarked with specific requirements. And so if an individual is going to community college first, there's a lot of funds that are earmarked there. And then if you start looking at state institutions, merit need-based aid, you look closely, oftentimes you do not have to have a social security number for that. It may be encouraged, but it's not always required. So I would just look further into what your state puts out there. And then lastly is just advocacy efforts. So meeting with community stakeholders about opportunities of partnerships, learning about what's going on and how you can help the students that you're serving. You can contact your congressperson. There's askyourrep.co, which actually will list who your congressperson is in your area. If you're eligible to vote, you should vote at the local, state, and federal level. You want to stay informed, as we talked about. And then identifying, advocating at that local, state, and national level. What does that look like for you? Do you want to promote advocacy just in your immediate sphere? Do you want to move that up towards the state level? Or are you interested in doing more national level work? Something that's unique to undocumented immigrants specifically that I just want to mention if you're working with them is family planning and know your rights. So know your rights is you can get these very small like handouts that you can keep with you if you think it's necessary that tells individuals what the rights are that they have. You do not have to open your door. You have the right to remain silent. You have a right to an attorney, and you should ask for an attorney who speaks your native language if you are not fluent in English. There are very specific warrants for undocumented immigrants when an individual comes. It has to be someone from ICE. It can't necessarily be just a police officer. There's a lot to that. If there's only one person listed on the warrant, do not open the door for so many people for them to come in. If you open the door, anybody that's in that room can actually be taken out. So if you go, okay, it's just this one person listed, they step outside the door, they close the door behind them. So just having knowledge of know your rights is really important as well. And then there's something called family planning. So heaven forbid, some ICE comes to pick up a family member, or let's say they pick up both parents of a child. What is the plan that the family has? Where will their child go? What legal processes do they have in place? Where are their important documents? So this doesn't fall under everybody's purview in terms of the work that we do. But even if you're having a conversation and you are noticing a type of concern, you can say, hey, have you talked to someone in legal aid or a local advocacy organization about family planning if you're having a concern? Are you familiar with Know Your Rights? And there's videos that you can look at as well. So being able to stay abreast of information is how you continue that relationship. That's not just us giving out these kind of resources, right? But we're able to say, hey, I know you, and I've learned so much about you, and I'm making these observations. And because I have this knowledge, I'm able to move forward in the conversation in a more meaningful way. And in that, I'm also being able to take in and learn from the person that's in front of me. So I do have my references here and my contact information. I'd love to spend some time just answering questions or going back to anything that you all think could be valuable to share. Happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melchior, for a very good and informative presentation. It really did touch me because, full disclosure, I'm an immigrant myself. And for a time, when I worked at the University of Oregon, I was the spokesperson for DACA,
Wow.
for undocumented students. So this information is very valuable, and I hope that our attendees ask questions because this is very important. But I really want to thank you for bringing to our consciousness the fact that we really need to be empathetic. Not only with undocumented students or DACA students, but with all immigrants. It's really hard, and I'm talking this from personal experience. It's very hard to leave your country, your culture. I remember my story, and I'll not take much time, but I was a high school principal in my country. And then we had to sell everything. We had 2 little kids, and we had to migrate here. That is about 24, 25 years ago. You come with 2 suitcases. What are you going to do with 2 suitcases? And everything is new. I didn't even know what kind of food I would buy at the store for my kids. Or you go to the store and there are 10 different brands of bread. And I'm like, why do we have 10 different brands of bread? Or you go to the toothpaste aisle. You're familiar with Colgate at that time, and then there's like hundreds of them. I mean, those little things, and you really totally feel overwhelmed. So I appreciate you talking about pre-trauma and post-trauma. Whether you are undocumented or not, that trauma is very real. And for a time there, you feel lost. You totally feel lost. So if anyone can really be empathetic and foster that connection, although sometimes folks are afraid of people who are new. Of course, the government have already labeled you as an alien. Hopefully they will change that. So this is very helpful conversation. One of the things we did in my former school, and I want to learn from you and maybe others who ask about this, is we know that for some immigrants, language is a big barrier. So even as you are talking to the students who are obviously proficient with English, in English, how about the parents? One of the things we did is to go to the high schools and talk to the parents. Because it's going to impact the students when it comes to financial aid, when it comes to know your rights. We had to translate some of the materials in common languages like Spanish and others. What is it you're doing at George Mason, or what did you tell everybody here? Like not only reaching to the out to the students, but reaching out to the parents too, because we have mixed status families. And there's a lot of fear, honestly, when it comes to undocumented students. There's so much fear. I remember we had to prepare a space where they only had the key just to come in and talk to each other because they were very afraid, especially after 2016. They were very, very afraid. So can you give us some best practices of what you are doing in your university? And I hope that others would share.
Yeah, so at George Mason, we have Undocu Mason, who's very active at the institution. Aside from Undocu ally trainings, they do a really good job of just keeping individuals informed of what we're able to do at George Mason. So one thing that we spent time on, I want to say it was 2019, was looking back at the application. So were there barriers to the admissions application for individuals who are undocumented? And then what barriers were there in the financial aid standpoint, and advocating for resources. So financial aid resources became a really big one also. And then even within certain programs. So my field would be one, you have to obtain a license to be a counselor. That's a barrier because there's certain information that you have to share. So what do we need to know in our fields about licensure for someone who's undocumented? Are they even able to get a license? If they do, if they have DACA and they get a license, the work authorization only lasts for the duration of DACA. So once that ends, your work authorization ends and your license ends. So your license is expired on the date that your DACA expires. And so depending on the field that you're in, you're actually kind of always in this kind of hurry up and wait of keeping your information. So a big thing that we're trying to do is making sure we inform programs. How do you work with these students so that they can continue to pursue their career? Sometimes we have a tendency to stop at just like getting them into college, but eventually they're going to graduate. So being able to create opportunities for that as well. In the K-12 setting, something that we did, which was probably one of my most favorite things to do, was we did a holiday celebration, and students whose parents were immigrants, and it really was for minoritized students, but we had a lot of immigrant parents that came, they brought something, and we just had our holiday dinner every year. And I noticed that just that alone, they started coming, asking questions, they started inquiring more. And then once you build relationships and you build a reputation, that allows for more people to have access. So I was in a very rural area and I became known as the school counselor who could talk to you about immigrant stuff. And so I would get random phone calls from an elementary school of a parent who's sitting there asking for help. I would sit in my office and fill out DACA applications with people. It's just all about what are you willing to participate in? How can you sit in a space with someone and be helpful? So those are a few things that we have done or that I have done.
Yeah, thank you for that. We do have a question in the Q&A. One of the attendees is asking, how have you handled rejection from your students because of their negative association with your identity, despite using all your skills to connect and relate? And how did it make you feel?
That's a big question. I think until I got to George Mason, I was in a predominantly white institution. And as a school counselor, it was predominantly white. It was painful in different ways. As a school counselor, you're trying to help kids. And I remember times where their parents wouldn't shake my hand. They would ask to speak to someone other than me. I was the only Black counselor, and I had to allow them that. I remember a time when a student brought a noose to school and said it was for hanging Black people. So, and he was my caseload, and I couldn't talk to him because he was not comfortable, and rightfully I was not. So I think I've had to learn to protect myself, because in these relationships, you can be re-traumatized for an identity that you hold. But I also believe that the way in which I model empathy to them, that I model kindness to them, that I'm able to speak truth to the power that they hold in a societal space, even though I might have the power as the professor. But if I speak truth to that power within them, then they can at least sit back sometimes and be like, was I wrong about this person, or about this particular group? And that has seemed to help me move forward. And also, I've learned to just sit with the rejection. Everybody's not going to stay in your space, and they're not always going to want to. Connection can't be pushed on. And so recognizing when you need to step back and say, okay, I'm not the best person to help you. I think in my field, I've had very weird experiences, especially as it relates to race, where I've had to just say, I can get a white clinician for you, because I am not the one that you want to help you. And as much as that can be hurtful, first and foremost, it's to see people be well. And if they're not comfortable with me, then I am essentially hindering their wellness. That was a really good question.
Yeah, you cannot push, you can't push relationships. You can try, but you have to find alternatives to support the student. So my other question would be, I know you mentioned California as a model of support for undocumented students, and I know Oregon is too, because I work there. What other states would you recommend for students and their families, states that are supportive and don't have all these negative, well, maybe rules that in registration that does not support undocumented?
So there aren't very many, and a lot of them do exist on the West Coast. One of my most helpful resources, I'll put it in here, is called YouLead. I think it's youlead.net. And it actually will tell you all the restrictions in your state. And so the ones that we seem to be most helpful is across that little Western corridor right here, or maybe New York, or maybe Illinois, like these pockets. The further south you get, the more restrictive you get. And so what I've been trying to look at is, if your state itself is restrictive, is the institution, because the institution could have more resources than the state itself. They could actually offer something that maybe the state is kind of creating a barrier on. So that's something I would actually look at. And then even recognizing states that specifically, and I don't think they've changed this yet, but this in South Carolina is one of them, where if you're undocumented, you're paying international tuition. You're paying tuition as an international student. That's a huge fee. That's a game changer, because that's a lot of money. So looking at something like that, especially in recruitment, I believe if someone wants to go to college, they should have the opportunity and access to do so, but they should have also the knowledge of what it will cost them. And if it's something like that, and they can go to community college for 2 years for free, go there first, and then go to a 4-year institution, because now you're just kind of spilling out money that most of us don't have.
And someone in the chat said, we really do respect and appreciate what you're sharing. You're very thankful for that. Can you speak a little bit about financial aid and being undocumented? Because one of the things I observed when I was doing this work directly was the fear that even the parents had in supporting their students to ask for any sort of aid, because some states will give aid and they really don't ask for social security numbers. Can you address this? Because I think there's some confusion about that.
Yeah. So you know how we usually have to fill out the FAFSA to show eligibility for what we can get. So, and there was like this estimated family contribution, but on the FAFSA, people don't know, you can actually put all zeros.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is show the tax form. And that shows your family contribution. So it's that's probably one that I'm like, please do not tell people not to fill out the FAFSA. Please fill it out. You have to fill it out because it'll show what you're eligible for. So while you can't get federal like loans, you can get any aid that is given by the state institution or by, say, a foundation.
Exactly.
So if someone has like especially you see someone, man, you should really get this. I know you're qualified and maybe there's a social requirement on there, you just email them. I think sometimes we just have a tendency to be like, oh, it says you have to have a social and you don't have oh gosh, so sorry. No, we're gonna ask. And there's like Rotary clubs do this a lot. That's just some local people who put money in a pot that's not connected to any governmental agency. They can take social security number off of that application. That's not necessary. I need you to run that student that money. So we can reach out to those people and then say, is this necessary? Okay, great. I'm glad to know. They're going to go ahead and apply. But if we don't ask, people lose out on a lot of money that's available to them.
Yeah, and I'm very grateful for you mentioning that, because that EFC is how we know who needs the grant. So if you don't complete that FAFSA, the school is not going to know who needs the grant money. So it's very critical for even undocumented students to complete the FAFSA and put all zeros, because the financial aid offices and IRS really are not connected. And folks really have to understand that the IRS is not coming after the school, like who is paying their taxes and who's not. So one more question before we finish this. I'm just wondering, have you ever encountered professors or counselors who are not supportive of these students just because of their political views, because they feel like, oh, why did you leave your country? Go back to your country. We have heard that rhetoric over and over again. And these professors are also people who have political views. I mean, maybe that's a strange question, but I know it's a relevant question. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so a lot of us who are immigrant activists talk about
what would you tell them to do or not to do?
So a lot of us talk about humanizing the issue. So are you seeing an immigrant who society has painted in a negative light? Is that who you're seeing? And you're not seeing this individual person who is in front of you, and they carry all of these emotions and thoughts and feelings. My thing about, or my frustration is, people have a tendency to look at immigrants like they're animals. And we've heard this kind of rhetoric come up before, that they are not humans. And that thought process creates significant disconnection in the relationship. So usually when I hear someone say to me, well, they just need to come over here the right way. There's ways to do this. And I'm like, okay, so you want to take 15 to 20 years to come over to this country when you do not feel safe, when your family does not feel safe. I'm humanizing that. Go to a point of empathy. But even if you feel like these policies and procedures should be in place, then you need to educate yourself. Because if you go look at the way our government is situated, immigrant populations do not take anything from you. They contribute to the economy in such a meaningful way. It actually behooves us to have comprehensive immigration reform. When you give people facts and data, that's probably the best thing that I have learned, is give them data and tell them, because we live in a capitalistic society, it is bringing you money. It does not cost you. Immigration does not cost you. Those people are paying to come in here. And then they are stimulating your economy, billions and billions of dollars. So when we remember things like that, that's kind of my comeback to people, is very much. But I collected my data for my dissertation a week after Trump was elected, and it was a hot mess because people were uncomfortable. It was a big ask. It's not a huge population of advocates in my field, unfortunately. So we're kind of still in this growing space of what does that look like, of how to help people who are undocumented specifically.
And I think that's really a good point to end on and remind people that whether you're an immigrant who came undocumented or quote unquote the right way, you still are landing in a foreign space, and you still need folks who are going to be supportive of you as you transition, who are going to be supportive as you find a school to join, as you make sure that you are part of the society. So whether you come the right way or not, you're still a human being. I mean, some of us did come that right way, and that right way is not an easy way. It can take years. It's an expensive process, and I hope that the implicit bias and the stereotypes of immigrants does not really color the way we treat them. They are human beings, and if you're a counselor or a professor out there, please be supportive of your students, of other colleagues who desire that empathy. So I want to thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Shakila Melchior, thank you so very much. And I want to remind our attendees, if you want Dr. Shakila's PowerPoint, please email ncorewebinars@ou.edu. Please write a thank you note down there as we exit to thank her for everything that she has done today, all the information. Thank you so, so very much. I want to thank everybody for joining us here from the University of Oklahoma in Norman. I want to thank our ASL interpreters and our captioner and my NCORE team. We thank you so very much, and we look forward for you to join us in our next webinar. And I want to remind everyone that NCORE is in Portland, Oregon in 2022. If you have something that you want us to learn, something that you want us to discuss, the call for proposals is still open. Please send us your call for proposals. Thank you so very much, everybody, and have a good evening. And thank you again, Dr. Shakila. We are so appreciative of you joining us. Thank you, everybody.